Hello, Georgetown. I'm Beverly Enos, and this is Spotlight Georgetown. You can find us Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, 8 in the morning and 8 in the evening. You'll find us at other times too, but those are the standard times for us. This is part of your local cable, and if you would like to become part of this show or use the equipment or learn how to edit, they do have all the equipment that you would need. You can borrow it and do some work for a nonprofit that you possibly have some connections with, but this is your cable, so think about joining us. If you would like to be in the hot seat over here, let me know. I'm always looking for people to be interviewed. And today we're talking to Peter Sarno and AnneDriscoll. We're talking about writing and publishing books. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. A little background for us. Peter, how long have you been in town?
Just about 20 years.
Okay, and where did you come from before?
Revere.
Oh, okay.
Actually, we lived in Lawrence when I got married, but I was born and raised in Revere.
All right, not too far away. So
No.
you came to the country.
Yes, yes. It was the country.
It was
then.
right, it was the country then. And you have family here in town?
Yes. My wife's a visiting nurse, Nanette. And actually, years ago, my mother used to come up here for summers. Years and years ago.
That's how I get started here. Summers on Lake Shores.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course, you weren't years and years ago, and my mother wouldn't appreciate me saying that.
Yeah, it was 50 some odd years ago, so it's been a while. You also served the town in other capacities other than what your job is. You were a selectman.
I was on the planning board, and I was also on the board of selectmen, so about 10 or so years.
So you're still in town and you still kind of keeping track of what goes on?
Yeah, I still get involved, and I'm open to helping whenever I can.
Watch out.
Yeah.
People do watch this. You'll be getting phone calls. Peter, would you like to help me with? And educational background, because that's always interesting, especially when you're talking writing and publishing and things.
Well, I got my bachelor's degree quite a while ago, and then I did a lot of freelance writing, and then actually got a real job when I got married and worked 9 to 5 a lot with computers and telephones and facilities. And then I had started my graduate degree and didn't complete it. And probably about, good 7 years ago, I went back, finished my degree, and was offered a teaching job at UMass.
Oh, wow.
And so I taught there for 5 years. And that's sort of the end way I get into publishing. So it wasn't so much from an academic program. It was just sort of, I was interested in the arts, interested in authors, and interested in writing. So.
Did you write all your life? I mean, some people, they start as kids writing.
I did. I don't think Anne did. I mean, my mother not long ago dug out a newspaper I wrote for the town, and with little pictures and stuff. So.
Cool.
And I did work for local newspapers and music magazines, and did a lot of freelance writing. So it was something I always liked. And I've submitted and published some short stories. Not as lucky as I'd like, but there's still a few stories in me.
That's probably the most interesting part of the show for me, is I find out things about people that I never knew. I had no idea that you ever wrote or were into any of that, because I know you from boards, being on the boards. Now, Anne, how about you? Where are you from?
I live in Swampscott. My sister lives in Byfield, so I do get in this area.
And what kind of a background do you have as education to become a writer?
Well, I have no education to become a writer. Although I always wrote, and I was one of those kids that started writing as a kid, I couldn't figure out how you could actually make a profitable career from that. It seemed kind of unlikely that you could find somebody who would pay you to write. So I thought I would be practical, and I decided instead to become a social worker. And I did that for a few years. That's what I was trained in. But I actually found out that when I quit my job as a social worker and to become a writer, all those skills that I learned as a social worker were quite useful as a reporter and a journalist. So,
creating characters and understanding them, and
well, interviewing people, getting them to feel comfortable with you, getting them to tell you things. So all those skills were very transferable. What I later found out is that, in fact, not only are the skill sets quite similar, but really the function is very much the same. When you're a social worker, you and that person are in a room, and that relationship is all about validating their experience, acting as a witness to what's happened to them. And in fact, that's what you really do as a reporter. You interview people and you validate that experience that they've had. The difference is, in my case, it could be either you and that person in a room as a social worker and a client, or it could be you and that person and 47 million readers of People magazine. So I've done both.
Now, we had recently Terry Pillardi, who was a writer in Georgetown. She came on, and she was also a writer as a child. Mm-hmm. And when she retired, she started compiling all these little stories that she had put together. And she wrote for the Georgetown newspaper, and she'd put another book together on what she had written about Georgetown. So some people really have a talent right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Writing is not my forte. This is more fun. How did you get into the publishing part of this?
It's purely by accident, really. So. It's been a happy accident. But about a year or so ago, I was teaching at UMass, and there was a book that I usually assign for many of my classes. It was a memoir that was introduced to me by Askell Melnichek, who's a writer's writer. He founded Agnes magazine, and he was actually one of the first to publish Girl Interrupted, Susanna Kaysen's book, before it was actually a book. And we had a memoir course when I went back from undergrad, and there was a book called Revere Beach Elegy, which was written by Roland Marullo. And so when I started teaching, I really liked this book, and we have a lot of first-generation students, as well as older students at UMass, and they really took to the book. They really took to the essays, and all of a sudden the book wasn't available. The bookstore called me one day and said, "Peter, the book's out of print. We can't get the book." And I called the author, and I said, "Is your book out of print? We can't get it." And so he called Beacon Press in Boston, and probably shouldn't share this, but they said, "Well, we have a few in the basement. If you want to buy them, you have your rights back." And so I was very happy to say, let's try to do something. And originally we were going to do it by an EBM machine, which Harvard Bookstore has. It's an electronic book machine. 4 minutes, you have a book. And we were going to sort of do print on demand. And when I first...
That's what Terry does, the other gal, yeah.
And it makes sense, but then when I first started to get involved, I said, well, what about distribution, and maybe we should do other things. And during the course of the project, Roland said, "Do you know anything about ebooks?" And I said, "No, but I know a lot about computers." And he said, "Well, I heard this thing, Barnes & Noble has this new thing called Pubit." And so the next thing you know, I said, "Well, why don't we do one for Barnes?" And so we ended up doing Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Apple, and then Roland referred me to other authors. And in the last year, we published close to 20 books. So, but it was purely an accident. That's sort of how it started.
A happy accident.
Yeah,
exactly.
A happy accident. Definitely. So, as a publisher, what's the process for you?
Well, I started initially with backlisted books, books that from established authors that have been reviewed, that were no longer in print for one reason or another. And you'll find that a book that just came out a few years ago can no longer be in print in this day and age, which is sad, actually. And so there were books that, like Roland's, that I really enjoyed, and there were authors that I respected, and so I develop a contract and say, "Gee, would you like to see this book back in print? I think we can help you out." And so we'd take the book, and in some cases you had to scan an existing book, convert it, set it up. I have an agreement with Ingram, which they're the largest distributor in the world. So what's nice is when my books are available in print, any bookstore can order them. So Anne's books came out, any bookstore can order them. So that and then the ebook, as you well know, and you can pretty much get them in a matter of a week if it's out. It's available. So
now, what is an ebook? Some people are not going to know what it is.
Well,
we
an
have a lot of people
ebook
that are not into computers.
is a book that can be read in an electronic format, and there are several electronic formats. Some
Kindles,
people,
Nooks,
exactly,
things like that.
exactly, and some are even online. You know, they'll sit at their PC and they'll read a book. There's a standard format called EPUB, pretty boring stuff, but that allows you to have this book read. But the exciting thing about ebooks, they've changed. Nook changed the landscape because they initially were the first to have color.
Right.
So kids' books were opened up to be read on a Nook or a tablet. Apple just did a wonderful version of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine with all kinds of music and moving submarines. I'm doing a book within the next few months. It's a companion piece to a movie. The woman was the last, she's been working on a documentary on the Carters and the Cashes, and she was the last person to interview Johnny Cash alive. And so we're doing a companion piece to the book. But the wonderful thing about the ebook version, we're doing a print version as well. But there are several scenes that ended up on the cutting room floor in the movie. We're going to have them as links in the ebook. So it's kind of exciting.
I mean, things have changed. Anne, how did you get started, or what experiences have you had with publishing before you got to know Peter?
Well, as Peter said, that he specializes in books that are backlisted, and so this book is Girl to Girl, The Real Deal and Being a Girl Today, is a republished, updated edition of a book that was first published in 1999. And I mentioned that I was started out as a social worker, but I also kept my license active. And at the time, at this point in time, I had a friend who called me one day, and she said, her daughter was 7 at the time, and she said, my daughter is having just a horrible time in school. She's, in this group, her class, the girls in her class are, one minute they're really nice to her, the next minute they're horrible to her. And she, this woman reads a lot. She's a PhD, and she took her daughter to the bookstore and couldn't find anything. She found one book, and when she told me that, it just set off a light bulb, and I thought, a self-help book for a 7-year-old, that makes sense to me. So I decided that there was really a market for that. And I wanted it to, I didn't feel like I was the expert for girls. I felt like girls are the expert on their lives. And so I really wanted to call on them and use their voices as the backbone of the book. So I set out to survey, like 100 girls. And the book was geared to girls 8 to 12. And so their voices are very much, the backbone of the book, the framework for the book. And it seemed to be a formula that really resonated with girls, because I heard back from a lot of girls that, they really liked the book. And right away, my publisher, it was a UK publisher, they decided to turn it into a series. And so within a year, I had 3 books out. And everything seemed to be just rolling along rosily. And but unfortunately, 2 weeks after my 3rd book came out, the publisher went out of business. The first book sold 24,000 copies through the publisher, and then it got picked up by Scholastic Book Clubs.
Okay.
Sold another 80,000 copies through Scholastic. And to date, I have received, in royalties, well, with the exception of Peter. So I like to say that I am the most successful writer I know, because the publisher went under, and they were in the UK, and I was here, and I was very low down on the food chain. So
She's made more from PFP in the last 3 months than she made.
I have. I absolutely have. So that's been my experience with publishing, and publishing has really changed extraordinarily in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's almost unrecognizable. I mean, it used to be kind of a gentleman's industry, and it's not at all. It's very cutthroat. It's very, I know a lot of writers who have horror stories far worse than mine, and so it's a very challenging time for authors. I really think so. And so somebody like Peter is just a godsend.
Thank you.
Isn't that nice?
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Peter,
Thank you.
Georgetown
Let me,
has.
I'm
Okay,
sorry.
go
I just
ahead.
want to say something about the book. I mean, the book. Years ago, there was a movie called Reds. I don't know if you remember that with Warren Beatty, and they had the witnesses throughout the movie. And I sort of look at this book as the girls are the witnesses. So, you know, Anne, as the author and social worker, may project an idea or a concept, but then you have the girls sort of chiming in as either the witnesses or the Greek chorus, and I think that's a wonderful format for the book, and there's a need for it, especially today.
Well, I have a 7-year-old granddaughter. Just turned 7 a couple of weeks ago, so I'm going to have to remember this.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. Georgetown does have a history, though, of having other writers.
Sure.
A lot of writers, and some very well-known names. Would you like to?
Well, I say to some of my writers friends that I'm on the wrong side of town because my success rate is not. So I have to drink the water from the other side of town because Paul Harding just won the Pulitzer. John Updike lived here, and a lot of his Rabbit series books were written right on Main Street.
Right.
You know, and there was a story that a lawyer in town told me. Do you remember the drugstore where the bank is? And it was one of the few places where there was a Xerox machine. And the lawyer used to get very upset because if Updike came in with a manuscript that he had to make a copy of, he'd be sitting there waiting for the, you know. And then I remember years ago somebody telling me how he, you know, he helped Updike change a tire, and he was just saying how nice a person he was, you know, and certainly a very hardworking author.
He used
and
to
you've
come
interviewed
to a lot of things in town too. He was kind of active in the town, and he'd go to social event type things. And most of the time, people didn't even know who he was because he was just very quiet about
He
himself.
was a humble man,
Yes.
yeah, but worked very, very hard and worked in several different genres. And from what I understand, Paul's the same way. You've interviewed some other authors during this program. Andre Dubus Sr., who I really, really respect, did his work, and that's how I ended up meeting Andre III. And you know, I know Andre a little bit, and Andre came to speak to some of my classes. And so they're just in Haverhill. Peggy Rombach is an author that I published. She lives in Andover. You know, Peter Gorelnik, who writes a lot. I think he wrote a very successful book about Elvis. Writes a lot about music. He's in Newbury. I mean, it's a lot of successful authors around here. That, as you say, they mix right in.
And a lot of people like to live more in the country atmosphere as opposed to living in the city. So this is a nice place, the whole area, that they can, you know, take the time to do what they like best, which is writing.
Sure.
Which is writing. They can do so much of that.
And there's there's an 8-lane highway to Boston if you need to go.
Right. Right. There's an upcoming library festival in Newburyport.
There's a literary festival.
A literary
Yes.
festival.
Yeah.
Wrong print. Yeah. Now, what's all that about?
Well, I think how long have they been doing it? Because you know some of the people involved.
I do. I think it's like 5 years at least. I'm not really sure, but yeah, they have a combination of people that are local. I mean, I know that Andre's been there a number of times, and people that are farther afield. But it's very well attended. It's, you know, the roster of talent that they have is just incredible, and I think it's a real testament to this area that they can attract really significant names and, you know, sizable talents to this area.
So what would a day at the festival be like, and how long does it run?
I think it's the 27th and 28th this year. I believe they have their own website, and I'm sorry I don't have it, but they do have their own website. And there will be workshops, there will be presentations by the authors, and they have sort of a nonfiction group, a fiction group, a children's group, and they have a pretty extensive website.
Yeah, you should take your granddaughter.
Yeah.
I've
And
done.
where is this held?
It's a lot of. They're in different venues, but I know the children's programs are mostly at the library, and so, you know, they've had great. You know, last year I know that one of the authors came in and taught kids how to make a book. They made their own books, and it's a great event, and it's all free.
Oh,
and
wow.
I think it's all free, as far as I know.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of the sections they might be, and it's probably purely just to help raise money for the next year. But But I think you're absolutely right. Most of it's free. I mean, the hope is that people buy books at the same time, but it's they put a lot of effort.
Yeah, and they have a lot of volunteers that put in a lot of time to put this all together. I know they work really hard.
I was just in one in Maynard a couple of weeks ago, and one of my authors was there. Roland Marullo was there, but Andre was there, and Rick Russo was there. I met Rick Russo, you know, Empire Falls and Nobody's Fool, and it was their first festival. They did a wonderful job, you know, and it's a shame because people used to make fun of Oprah when she had the book club, but I thought she did a wonderful service to bring recognition to the book back. And there are so many, you know, years ago even Johnny Carson and talk shows would have 20 minutes devoted to an author. But that's not the case anymore.
I think that, you know, there's a number of literary festivals that have really grown exponentially. I think Newburyport is a good example. There's a Boston Book Festival that's, you know, amazing. And I think that it really meets a need. I think it really, people want that kind of connection to authors, and, you know, so these festivals are a way to put people in touch with authors. And I think in many ways, Peter, that's what's wonderful about what you do, is that, you know, he sort of streamlines that process and puts, you know, authors in contact with their readers in a very kind of efficient and wonderful way. Yeah, I think it's really necessary. I mean, I think the world has changed, and so you know, he's capitalizing on simplifying that process and making it, making the literary word and the written word much more accessible to audiences that are interested in it.
And I think I'm a reader. I'm always reading something, at least one something. And most of us follow an author. If you find an author that you like, you follow the author.
Gee, I agree. Some people will disagree with us, but I think you're right. I think if you know, I like Rousseau, so you want to read all of his books, you know, and then sometimes you want to follow what's happening in their life, although that can be a dangerous thing. But, you know, D.H. Lawrence said, never trust the artist, trust the tale, you know, trust the work. But I agree. I think you end up following. The interesting thing is the landscape has changed tremendously. And I had dinner with an author that was reading in Providence, and he took me out to dinner, and he said he's from Florida, Sterling Watson, and I published one of his books, and hopefully we'll be publishing a couple of others, and he has a new book out from Akashic Press, so he was promoting that book. And he said to me, you appreciate this, Anne, I don't know if I shared this with you, but he said to me that nothing is the new no, and I had no idea what he meant. What's nothing? And what it is if you call your agent, you call your editor, and you call your publisher, or if you email them and you don't get a response, that means no. And years ago, you would you would get a courteous reply, you'd get a phone call, but so I think that, you know,
another example of how it's no longer a gentleman's business.
Right, they just avoid.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think a lot of people, that's in some ways even the playing field, and I think there will be a lot of small and more independent publishers emerging, because as long as you just have some basic courtesy, authors just want to be heard. They, you know, they want to be responded to, and sometimes they even want the bad news, you know. But, so.
Now, we already talked about how the publishing trends have changed. What kind of things do you expect to see in the future? I mean, we've become so modern with the computers and being able to do everything with just the touch of your fingers. What do you expect to see within the publishing world in the future?
Good question. I think, you know, I think the death of the printed book is sort of premature, and I'm grateful that it's premature. I mean, you certainly can't judge. Do you feel the same way?
I'm a page turner. I don't do the electronic.
I
like to turn the page.
And why?
Because it feels like I'm reading a book. You can get lost in the story when it's something that you have to turn the page to see what's going to happen next.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's a 3D. There's an emotional component that isn't. Perhaps in an e-format. That being said, I mean, I have a Mac, I have an IBM, I have an iPad, you know, by necessity. If you were to judge for my sales over the last, and it's only approximately 1,500 books, but if you were to judge for my sales over the last year, it's 50-50.
Really?
And so perhaps, which actually is probably not a bad thing, because people were saying it's even, you know, it's
But I
even
think you've
worse.
said that for the children's books, it's even greater.
I was
It's
just
like
gonna say, does
like
that have-
90-10.
You know, it's interesting. We'll take Anne's book as an example. When this book was released, and it was only released within the last couple of months, the first few months, I think maybe a couple of print books were sold, and they were all ebooks. And I mentioned it to my wife. I said, geez, you know, Anne's books are sold, they're selling, but they're all ebooks. And she said, yes, the parents are younger and the kids are younger, and that's how they're buying the books. And I didn't realize
Yeah.
that. But
I teach primarily in senior centers, so about 80% of my students and clients are seniors, they're elders. I would say out of the 100 students that I have every week, there might be 3 people that use a Nook or a Kindle or some sort of ebook. All the rest are paper turners. They're page turners. And I think that's a lot of the generation,
sure.
because
Absolutely.
they're not into the computers as much. Some of them don't even want to think about them, or they don't want answering machines. And my 7-year-old granddaughter has an iPad, and she reads everything on the iPad.
Because she's a digital native.
Right.
She grew up with digitized content, and
Even on their phones.
yeah, I mean, it's nothing to them. I mean, that's their world. So, and I'm sort of in between. I like a real book in my hand, but I also have found there are times that I'm glad that I have an iPad that I can read, Kindle versions of it. So,
Traveling is a little tough one, because if I'm traveling on vacation type thing, I'll read a book a day. And all of a sudden you go away for a couple of weeks and you've got this stack of books that you're trying to get into your luggage that you have to pay for now.
Well, that's a good point, because I had another author do a presentation in Florida, and there were approximately 150 people in Florida, and it was an older population. And this was about a year or so ago. And he said, how many, I don't know if I shared the story, and he said, how many people here have an e-reader? And he said about 75% raised their hand, and it was against type, but perhaps they were either traveling or they're down there for the summer and they want their library in their hands. So the downside to all this is that Amazon is somewhat the Walmart of the bookstores. And the way ebooks evolved is that originally the royalty structure was Barnes & Noble would give you 65%, and then Amazon turned around and said, we'll give you 70%. And so when Apple got in the game, they said, we'll give you 70%, and Kobo said, we'll give you 70%. The problem is that for every 100 Amazon Kindles that are sold, there's probably 20 Barnes & Noble Nook books, perhaps 10 Apple iBooks, and maybe 3 Kobo ebooks. If Amazon succeeds in pushing these other players, the royalty structure will change. The whole situation will change. So
That's the supply and demand. If they're the only kids on the block, then they'll get to have a little more control.
And that doesn't bode well.
And that's not good for the writers.
No.
the other thing, though, the other positive thing, and you touched on it a little bit, is that electronic versions of books, or it's not even fair really to even call them books, because the book that you were talking about that was the companion to the movie, in an electronic world, you have so much more ability to be creative and have, you click on this and you see video clip that came from the documentary or ended up on the cutting room floor. I went to a writers conference and a guy was developing a website called, I think it was called eStorybook, and what he was saying is that books are dead. I hate to tell you this, but he had a demo of a book about Amelia Earhart, and you read about her taking off, and you clicked on this hyperlink and you saw the video clip of her taking off, and then it went on to say that before she took off, she was being interviewed by reporters, and you click on the hyperlink and you hear the audio clip of that interview. And then you read on, and you can click on and see the map of where she was headed, or I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So, it just kind of opens up the experience.
It expands the world of what you're reading quite a bit. And
what you're consuming, because it's not just reading,
What do you think is the biggest challenge today for a writer?
Other than earning a living? I don't know. I think, there are challenges and there are lots of positive things happening. I think that in many ways it's easier than ever to connect with your audience. There are so many more outlets for, writing, so many more markets. And that's really positive for writers. You can blog, you can write for magazines, you can write for newspapers, you can create ebooks on your own. There's lots and lots of opportunities. The challenge, and I think that this has always been a challenge for writers, is how do you make a living from that? And I think you have to be very creative, you have to be very resourceful, and you have to be smart. You have to be, and I think this is true for artists always, is that it's, you can't just be creative, you also have to be a good business person.
You have to promote.
Yeah, and again, there's more of a push for you to have to do that. You really need to be able to market yourself, but there's also great opportunity for different ways to do that. So, it's kind of it's a mixed bag.
Now, what kind of books do you write? You said that the book that you have in your lap was for girls 8 to 12.
Yep.
Do you write all books like that that are geared towards children, or?
Yeah, I did a series of, this was the first in the series, and then there were two others. One was called Girl to Girl Sports in You, and the third was called Girl to Girl Friends in You. And I also have done the research to do a fourth, Girl to Girl Boys in You, which is not just about boys as, sort of crushes, but also boys that, are friends. But I do lots of other writing as well, and that's all part of being diversified and taking advantage you're advantage of the opportunities that are out there.
Tell
what
Beth,
project are you working on now?
About the Brandeis stuff, and you're doing something in terms of some witness programs and things like that.
Yeah, I wear a lot of different hats. One of them, I for example, I have freelanced for People magazine since 1998. So I cover a lot of stories for them out of New England and elsewhere, actually. But I also I also do some public relations for the Jean Geiger Crisis Center, which serves Georgetown.
Mm-hmm. That's where I did my training.
Oh, really?
And of course, the woman that runs that is
Andre's sister, right?
Yeah.
Andre, I wrote about for People magazine. Actually, it's all a very small world. But one of the other things I also do is I work at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism, and I investigate wrongful murder convictions there. So.
Oh my.
Yeah,
A little bit different from Girl to Girl.
I would say so.
But kind of in keeping with the whole social work thing. So, anyways, yeah. So my interests are broad, and but actually writing is a great passport for me. I can, I remember thinking, this is like the best job ever, that I get paid to talk to people, which I love to do. I get paid to learn, which I love to do, and I get paid to write, which I love to do. And as a freelancer, I get to do it on my own time. So I'm very blessed.
And anything that's on your own time, you can fit into your life.
That's right.
There's always something else that you can kind of think about and go in that direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When you're writing about the kids, you said, and I think you touched on it briefly, you said that when you started working with Peter, you went through the book. Is it because the kids have changed and the issues have changed?
It's a great question. To be honest, I hadn't looked at the book in a long time. So, I was like, ooh, this is going to be interesting. And when I went through and read it, I was very much surprised that while the world has changed a great deal, the girls haven't really changed that much. I mean, girls' nature is still very much the same. The world they live in is drastically different, and the challenges they face are different. But who girls are essentially the same as when you and I were girls, when my daughters were girls. You know,
they still think and have emotions.
They worry
the
about
same way.
the same things. They, you know, get happy about the same things. Their, you know, friendships are extraordinarily important.
Sleepovers is still fun.
Absolutely. That has not changed.
Anne said relationships are still a major priority in a girl's life.
Relationships,
Oh, yeah.
you know, drive girls' lives. That's what they're interested in. That's what they obsess about. That's what they think about. That's, you know, that's above all what is important to them.
And I think that's true for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But in a child's life, that's why they Girl Scouts,
Mm-hmm.
because they have their Girl Scout friends or their dance friends or their sports friends.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all different relationships other than with their mother and father,
Mm-hmm.
other than family relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that has not changed through the years.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to do this book initially was because I think girls get a bad rap that, you know, they're seen as being too emotional, you know, too talkative, like that's a bad thing. And in fact, girls are really adept at relationships. You know, they think about them all the time. They're very aware of them. They know the social landscape that they live in.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that as their strength. And I wanted to write a book that really affirmed that for them, that validated that, yeah, this is who you are and this is what makes you healthy.
Is the response different now than when you first wrote the book?
No, I mean, I have been, other than the fact that more books, you know, well, let's face it, ebooks didn't exist when this book first came out. So, and the fact that so many girls, that's what they're gravitating to. But no, the girls, I think, are very much responding to, you know, the way the book is structured, the voices of girls. You know, that's what they want. They want to connect with other girls, and this book is a way to do that.
As a follow-up to that, Beth, I'm laughing because I tried to sort of break it to Anne gently. We did the book launch, and I said, you know, historically, nowadays, people don't buy books at launches. You know, you'll be lucky if you sell books, but, you know, it's a good way to meet people, and, you know, they'll get to know you, and there's an exposure, and I'm going to order...
And the newspaper will write about you.
Right, and
yeah.
I'm going to order 50 books, but I want to tell you, Anne, you're not going to sell 50 books. Don't, you know, because I've been with major authors. 50 books would be a good night at a bookstore, you know. So we go to the launch, just in terms of your question about response, we go to the launch, and we had to run out to Anne's car because she happened to have 22 more books in the car. So we sold like 72 books. But so I was very pleasantly surprised. But so I think the need is there. But
how does it feel when people line up to buy what you have written?
It's a great feeling. It really is. I mean, it's just, there's nothing better. Except the fact that the book launch happened to be at, my middle daughter is a kindergarten teacher at the Chevres School in Malden. It's a Catholic parochial school. And so that's where the launch was. And the only thing that was better than having kids line up to have me sign their book was to watch them take the book then over to my daughter and have her sign their book.
So she's special by relationship.
well, I think the proof is in the pudding, too. And in addition to having it on paper, Anne's raised 3 wonderful kids. So
that's
she's
nice
very,
of you to say,
very
Peter.
wonderful parent, and the kids are great kids. So, well, they're not kids; they're young adults now. But.
Well, and it helps when you have the social work background to understand. Are they
It
all
does.
girls?
2 girls and a boy.
2 girls and a boy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, future plans for both of you. Where are you going next, and what are you looking into?
Well, Peter has asked me to do what he calls a singlet, which is sort of a, I don't know what
Remember
you
the
would
old
call
45s? The records, 45s? A lot of people don't. So it's you know, they have singles now, they call them, for books. And so for 99 cents or less, or sometimes a little bit more, you have a short story, a collection of short story, or an essay. Amazon has a very specific singles program, but you can sell a single in any ebook format. I just did one for called Last Call, but yeah, we've asked Anne to sort of work on one. And
On bullying.
Okay, so it has a very specific scope, and it's
It will
more-
be short.
and
You know, it's
like a
basically
short
like a
story.
chapter. Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's different. I've never heard of that before. That's different.
Yeah.
well, in one way, it allows people to sample an author. Well, my age anyway. You know, you'd get a 45 record, and if you liked the Bee Gees, then you'd go buy the Bee Gees album. You know, and so it's a way to sample an author in an ebook. It's a way to, maybe an author can think outside the box. If an author historically writes nonfiction, maybe they can try a story of fiction, you know, a work of fiction. And so it's kind of a neat little format. And years ago, there was a bookstore in San Francisco, City Lights, where Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg and some of the other artists of the 60s and early 70s. And what would happen is they'd come out with a poem, they'd go in the back room, they'd mimeograph it, and be out in the streets in 2 hours. And that's what these singles, you can pretty much in 2 days, they're available to the
something
world.
Neat.
Yeah.
So.
It's
Very
exciting.
different. Yeah. And what are you looking to do that's different?
Well, I'm just still trying to think outside of the box. I decided that we did one new book last year. It's called Demons of the Blank Page, and it's a book on writing. And it's a book on creativity, not necessarily just writing, but what's, you know, do I have writer's block? What's stopping me from creating? You know, can I accept criticism? Do I know how to revise? Who should I get to read the book? And so that was one of the first new books we've done. So I'm thinking of trying to open it up to new authors. We're doing a collection of short stories probably sometime in the summer by Matt Fillion, who actually used to edit the Georgetown Record years ago.
Oh, I remember Matt.
Yeah, he's Shop Kid. And so we're doing a collection of his short stories. And I'm just trying to figure a way to reach the audience. I mean, Anne had mentioned social media, Facebook, and what have you. There's different ways. We're thinking of doing a house event with several house authors. I don't know if we're going to sell a lot of books, but we might have some fun doing it. I'm lucky enough that 2 of our books have a movie option right now. Movie options don't mean nothing necessarily, but if one of them took off, that would make a big difference in my life and my authors' lives. And one of the authors is working on a sequel to one of the books that we have. Sometimes that brings interest. You mentioned author interest. That might bring interest in the first book. So I think reaching the audience and maybe doing some new stuff, new authors would be the way.
Now, you said the word agent, one of you earlier. Do people use agents anymore, or do they just come direct to somebody like you?
Both. I've had some interesting conversations. Several of my authors have agents. I had one very cantankerous conversation, a series of conversations with agents, and I think sometimes agents help and sometimes they hurt. This author didn't understand why, I don't know if I shared this, but didn't understand why I wanted to do a print book as well as an ebook. She said, why do the print book at all? And I heard a story years ago from a friend of Dennis Lehane and Mystic River.
Yep.
He let somebody borrow it, who let somebody borrow it, and it was sitting on the coffee table. And Clint Eastwood was the neighbor of that person. He saw it on the coffee table and he said, oh, would I like this book? He said, yeah, why don't you? So evidently Clint picked it up and read it over the weekend and called Dennis on Tuesday and said, I'd like to make a movie of your book. And I don't know if that would happen if it was an ebook only. So
I don't know that reviewers review non-print
well, that's a very good question. I think in the future they'll probably be forced to. But the other thing is, I told this agent, I said, I want something to show for my effort. You know, we've worked hard, and I love book covers. I think book covers, it's, you know, it's a way. And what's nice about a small firm like mine is, for example, if you're with a major house, they tell you what your cover is. You have no choice.
Okay.
So if you're with Random House, this is your cover of your new book.
They have an artist that designs it, and it's their decision.
In the marketing division, and that's it. Like it or
Okay.
lump it. And some of those covers are wonderful, and some really don't work. So I'm able to work with an author. Anne and I took quite a, and her daughters and her nieces and nephews, we took a long time to put that cover together. And so it's kind of a wonderful process that the author gets. Elizabeth Searle's book, A Four-Sided Bed, we probably worked on 200 versions of the cover. She loves that cover. And so I think it's great to be able to let an author expand their vision by working with a cover. So
I think that's an example of what I was talking about when I said, you know, your model of how you're doing publishing streamlines the whole process, and that's exactly, and makes it more accessible both to the author and to the audience. So that's an example of that.
And I think the cover, for me as a reader, I want the cover to reflect what's inside. Because sometimes I'll buy something that I don't know the author, but the cover intrigues me.
Sure.
And then I'll get into it and think, well, it doesn't have anything to do with what the cover looks like.
Which is sad, isn't it? It's sad. And you know what, I've had some freedom, Bev, too, because historically black and white is a no-no. And we've done, of the books we've published, 2 of them were black and white, because I like black and white. I'm colorblind as well, so I don't know if that's why, but I think, you know, beside it's lending itself to some sort of 40ish, you know, noir, I think it also, you should have the freedom to have black and white on the cover. I mean,
we had a black and white movie this year.
Exactly.
Academy Award.
Exactly, and that was a person thinking outside of the box, and God bless that person, because very successful.
Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having
Appreciate
me.
your time.
Thank you.
I'm Beverly Enos. This is Spotlight Georgetown. If you are an author, call Peter. And if you're an author, call me, because you'll be next to be interviewed. This is Spotlight Georgetown, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Thank you for joining us today. Bye for now.